What we're going to do is start with a presentation by Stephen Druker, and then we will do some question-answer. Patrick Battle and I will. I'll give you their biographical information in a minute. Then we'll go into some interesting things that we've learned from the computational world that can be applied to help us better understand the risks of genetic modification. And we'll be joined by Brian Draward at that point, and we'll just go from there. And we will also be leaving some time for audience QA. To make sure that happens, I'm going to just say my name is Dee Eggers, and I am an associate professor in the Environmental Studies Department here at UNC Asheville, and I'm going to leave my biography there because theirs are long. So I will start with Stephen's, and I'm going to edit a little bit. So Stephen Druker is a public interest attorney who founded the Alliance for Biointegrity and, as its executive director, initiated a lawsuit that forced the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to divulge its files on genetically engineered foods. This was over 44,000 documents. This revealed that politically influenced administrators had covered up the extensive warnings of their own scientists about the abnormal risks, misrepresented the facts, and then allowed these novel products onto the market without requiring the testing that's mandated by federal food safety law. He's a prominent commentator on the risks and regulatory issues of GE food, has served on food safety panels at conferences conducted by the National Research Council and the Food and Drug Administration, has been invited to speak many places by many people, including a president. His influential book, which I highly recommend, is called Altered Genes, Twisted Truth: How the Venture to Genetically Engineer Our Foods Has Subverted Science, Corrupted Government, and Systematically Deceived the Public. It was released in March 2015. It is one of the best researched books I have ever read. It's also one of the most lucidly written and easy to understand for a layperson, and it's a fascinating read. So Altered Genes, Twisted Truth. I don't get any money for that. He majored in philosophy at UC Berkeley and went on to get his law degree also at UC Berkeley. So I'm going to introduce Pat next, but please join me in welcoming Stephen. Patrick Battle is a well-known organic and beyond organic farmer, and I think it's perfect that there's actually a spider crawling across this bio right now. It doesn't appear to be in duress. Okay, there we go. All right. Patrick Battle is the director of Living Web Farms, a nonprofit educational and research farm and sustainable living facility. He's worked for 40 years in all aspects of our food system to create socially and environmentally just and regenerative food production systems. His experience includes work as a chef, baker, oil rig steward, organic poultry farmer, organic vegetable and mushroom CSA market farmer, slaughterhouse worker, Christmas tree farm worker, restaurant co-owner, bakery co-owner, and compost facility manager. He loves to cook and eat the food he grows. He's been scrutinizing and demanding accountability from the genetic engineering industry since the late 1990s. First, let's welcome Patrick Battle. Sorry about that. Great, so I will turn it over to Stephen to give you some background.
Thank you very much. I'm appreciative for that really fine introduction and your praise for my book. You aren't the only one. The foreword to the book was written by Jane Goodall, who states it's without doubt one of the most important books of the last 50 years, and many other scientists have praised it as well, and hardly any as beautifully as you just did. Thank you very much. And I also would like to express my thanks to Professor Eggers for having sponsored this event and coordinated it, and to Patrick for Patrick's organization for helping provided the financial sponsorship for getting me here. And I can attest that he is a great cook. I've been staying at his house the last few days. And thank you all for coming. And again, it's impressive you're here during a break, and I hope we'll give you an entertaining and educational evening. A fundamental distinction between science and politics is the degree to which their practitioners are bound by the facts. In the field of science, the bond is typically tight, while in the field of politics, it is usually much looser, often to a dramatic degree. Thus, whereas the historian of science, Jacob Bernowski, emphasized that scientists must conform to the facts, the political historian Henry Adams remarked that the practice of politics largely consists in ignoring them. And Bernowski stressed that scientists must cultivate what he referred to as the habit of truth, while we clearly know that many politicians have thrived by habitually distorting it. Further, because both the prevalence and influence of falsehood are escalating within the political arena, not only within totalitarian societies, but also within advanced democracies, it is even more imperative that the boundary between science and politics be preserved, and that science remains a realm in which the facts are honored and honest communication is the norm. However, over the last 45 years, this crucial boundary has been substantially eroded in regard to the preeminent field of applied science, biotechnology. Because the advent of the revolutionary technology of genetic engineering in the early 1970s stirred widespread concerns, the scientists and scientific institutions that were developing and promoting it were put on the defensive. But in their attempt to allay public qualms and to forestall government regulation, many of them strayed from the principles they had been trained to uphold and adopted the techniques of spin doctors advancing political campaigns. Moreover, in many cases, they did not merely put a favorable spin on the facts, but seriously misrepresented them, falsely describing the engineering process, the related research, and even some biological realities in order to make the technology seem more natural and innocuous than it actually is. As genetic engineering, which I'll be referring to as GE, expanded into food production and the public's qualms increased, the misinformation intensified and became a persistent feature of the agricultural biotechnology enterprise. Over the years, it has become so systematic, entrenched, and ostensibly authoritative that the opinions of most journalists, legislators, and even of most scientists have been molded by it. Compounding the problems through unjustified attacks on research that has revealed harm and unwarranted rebukes of scientists who've raised concerns, a powerful contingent of pro-GE scientists have been inhibiting the free flow of information on which science depends. Therefore, although it is commonly believed that all contemporary attacks on science are coming from outside the scientific community, one of the most dangerous assaults is coming from within. As major components of the scientific establishment, acting under the banner of science, routinely distort the facts and suppress open discourse in their defense of GE foods. These regrettable phenomena have been thoroughly documented, but very few people are aware of them. Therefore, although they constitute the biggest issue in bioethics, it's an issue that most bioethicists have completely overlooked. This evening, I'll be providing several striking examples that reveal how twisting the truth on behalf of biotechnology has become a customary practice within the scientific community. My book provides detailed backup of all these examples, and the astounding extent of the misrepresentations it chronicles is in itself solid evidence of how strongly the aggregate evidence weighs against the safety of genetically engineered foods. Because, as should be quite obvious, if the evidence were as strong as it is purported to be, there would have been no need to distort it. Further, my book, along with other solidly researched publications, demonstrate that when the misinformation is dispelled and the facts are clarified, there are strong science-based reasons for reaching three basic conclusions. One, producing new foods through recombinant DNA technology, genetic engineering, is an inherently risky process which entails that every GE food poses an abnormal level of risk. Two, the safety of those on the market has never been adequately established. And 3, some of them have already been shown to be harmful. I will now briefly survey some of the biggest falsehoods that have been dispensed on behalf of GE Foods. And I look forward to delving more deeply into the surrounding facts during the subsequent discussion period. Let's first examine one of the biggest fictions that's been perpetrated in defense of GE Foods. It's the routine assertion that there's an overwhelming scientific consensus that they are safe, and that this consensus is based on solid scientific evidence. Indeed, the strength of this purported consensus is claimed to be on a par with the degree of expert consensus about the reality of human-induced climate change. However, although there truly is a genuine scientific consensus in the case of climate change, there has never been one regarding genetically engineered foods. And whereas every group of experts that has examined the data related to climate change has reached a common conclusion, many well-credentialed experts have raised cautions about GE Foods, and several respective scientific institutions have done so as well. For instance, in 2001, the Royal Society of Canada issued a report concluding, A, that the default prediction for each GE food should be that the genetic alteration has induced unintended and potentially harmful side effects, and B, that it is, in their words, scientifically unjustifiable to regard any GE food as safe unless its safety has been established through a course of testing far more rigorous than any regulators have yet required. That report has never been revised, retracted, or refuted, and it is as relevant today as it was when it was issued. The British Medical Association has also expressed concerns about the risks, and the Public Health Association of Australia recently called for a complete moratorium on the planting and marketing of GE foods until their safety has been confirmed through far better testing. The scientific experts at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, likewise recognized that GE foods entail abnormal risks. This fact came to light in 1998 when my organization, the Alliance for Biointegrity, led a lawsuit that compelled the FDA to hand over more than 44,000 pages of its internal files on GE foods. Within that trove of documents were a number of memos from the agency's own scientists expressing concerns about the unusual risks of genetic engineering and the need for all the foods it produces to undergo rigorous safety testing that's capable of protecting the potential unexpected side effects. The pervasiveness of the concerns is attested by an FDA official who studied the expert input and declared, quote, "The processes of genetic engineering and traditional breeding are different, and according to the technical experts of the agency, they lead to different risks." Moreover, the FDA's biotechnology coordinator acknowledged there was not a consensus about safety in the scientific community outside the FDA either. Okay, let's move on to a related claim, the claim that genetically engineered foods are well regulated. First, let's look at the case of the FDA. We repeatedly hear the claim that in order to receive regulatory approval in the United States, each GE crop must be subjected to rigorous testing. Unfortunately, that's baloney. In reality, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration does not regulate GE foods in any way. That's not an exaggeration. Not only can a GE food be put on the market without a smidgen of testing, its manufacturer does not even have to inform the FDA that it is going to inject the food into our food supply. Now, although the FDA does conduct a purely voluntary consultation process, which is designed to project the illusion that there is some testing going on, it is far too superficial to provide any reliable results. And even the agency's own biotechnology coordinator has admitted that it does not constitute a scientific review. Of course, you might be wondering how, In light of the warnings the agency received from its scientific staff, such a lax policy could have been instituted. Well, the answer is simple. The FDA has an admitted agenda to foster biotechnology, and it has been more strongly committed to this agenda than to honoring science and the truth and following the law. Consequently, agency decision makers ignored the input from their experts, covered it up, and then even lied about it. When the FDA issued its policy in May of 1992, it claimed that it was not aware of any information showing that genetically engineered foods differ from other foods in any uniform or meaningful way. It also asserted there was overwhelming consensus among scientists that GE foods are so safe they don't require any testing, even though it full well knew that no consensus existed, either inside the agency or outside the agency. If the FDA had told the truth and disclosed the extensive concerns of its own experts, the subsequent history of the GE food venture would surely have been quite different and might well have been very short. At minimum, any GE foods that did reach the market would have been subjected to much more rigorous testing than has been the case, and that regulators anywhere have yet required. Well, what about those regulators outside the US, the regulators in Canada, the EU, Australia? Well, in contrast to the FDA, they do require some testing, but unfortunately it's still very lax. A large percentage of GE foods approved by these other regulators have gained approval through the concept of substantial equivalence, an approach that the Royal Society of Canada has charged is scientifically unjustifiable. Further, the tests that did go beyond the weak substantial equivalence requirements do not provide assurance of safety either, and there have been too many instances in which they have indicated problems, but those problems have been ignored. For instance, in 2009, a systematic review of the toxicological studies on GE foods that was published in Critical Reviews in Food Science and Nutrition concluded the results of most of them, indicate that the products may cause unintended and potentially harmful side effects. Moreover, a team of university scientists published a paper in 2011 in which they reviewed the data from 19 of the feeding studies on GE soy and corn varieties that had already gone through the regulatory process and were on the market and be consumed by millions of people in North America and other countries. And what they found was quite disturbing. 9% of the measured parameters, including blood and urine biochemistry and organ weights, were significantly disrupted in the animals that had eaten the GE feed. Moreover, the greatest disturbances were to the kidneys of the males and the livers of the females. And the researchers emphasized that such findings did raise great concern and should have been paid attention to because the livers and the kidneys are the major reactive organs in cases of chronic food toxicity. So they said these signs, these signals, these findings should have been taken as warning signs, something which the regulators had not seen fit to do. What about the claim that the genetic engineering process is no more disruptive than traditional breeding? Well, to make genetic engineering look more natural and innocuous than it is, its proponents have routinely tried to make natural processes appear more random and unruly than they actually are. They try to make natural processes look bad in order to make genetic engineering look more acceptable. And even eminent scientific institutions, such as the US National Academy of Sciences and the UK Royal Society, have made false statements about biological realities in order to enhance the image of GE foods and mislead people about their risks. One of the many ways has been in misrepresenting the frequency of natural horizontal gene transfer. For instance, in a 2016 publication, the UK Royal Society falsely asserted, 1, that all plant genomes frequently receive insertions of new DNA through viral and bacterial infections and also through the activity of transposons, which they referred to as jumping genes, and 2, that these insertions are similar to those made via genetic engineering, and 3, that conventional breeding is therefore just as likely to induce unforeseen consequences. But those claims are all false. In reality, plant genomes very rarely are altered by the insertions of DNA from viruses and bacteria or through the activity of jumping genes. In fact, it is solely through genetic engineering that plant genomes have become recently and frequently endowed with new viral DNA. And genetic engineering also substantially increases the risks of alterations due to jumping genes. Okay, another way in which misrepresentations have occurred is misrepresenting conventional breeding's risks of creating novel toxins. You see, it is known that genetic engineering can produce novel toxins. That's been demonstrated. So the proponents claim that conventional breeding can do the same thing, that it's just as risky in that regard. For instance, the 2004 report of the National Academy of Science claimed that the same risk is posed by traditional breeding and that novel toxins can be formed anytime. Okay, they said anytime conventional breeding is employed, there's a risk of novel toxins being formed. But they could only provide one example, and that example is bogus. They claimed the particular toxin in a new potato had never been produced in either parent potato. But that chemical not only was produced by the parents, it is produced by almost every potato during development. So it was a clearly deceptive claim. In fact, 8 experts who co-authored an article published in Plant Physiology in 2013 asserted that there has never been a report of a completely novel toxin or a novel allergen appearing as a result of conventional breeding. They therefore concluded that the likelihood that any will occur through conventional methods, quote, is virtually zero. Thus, the threat of novel toxins is itself novel and unique to genetic engineering. Well, what about the oft-repeated claim that no ingestible product of genetic engineering has ever been linked to a human health problem? That's also starkly at odds with reality. In fact, the technology's very first ingestible product caused an epidemic that killed dozens of Americans and seriously sickened thousands, permanently disabling many of them. By the way, how many of you have known up to now that the very first ingestible product of genetic engineering caused a major epidemic here in North America? Just a show of hands. How many of you knew that? Hardly anybody, and it's not surprising because as the 3rd chapter of my book shows, that disaster has been, the facts about that disaster have been so clouded that most people don't know it even happened. And that was intentionally done. That chapter goes, it's incredible to see the extent to which basic facts about that disaster have been covered up and misrepresented, even by the Food and Drug Administration, which has been, unfortunately, one of the key culprits. Now, that product was a food supplement of the essential amino acid L-tryptophan that had been derived from genetically engineered bacteria. And although it met the standards for pharmacological purity, like all other tryptophan supplements, it contained minute amounts of impurities. However, unlike the conventionally produced supplements, one or more of its accidental additions was highly toxic, even at extremely low levels that should not have created a problem. Moreover, the evidence points to genetic engineering as the most likely cause of the toxic contamination. Now, the toxic tryptophan incident has serious implications for all foods produced through genetic engineering. Why? Well, for one thing, those bacteria had not been altered with foreign genes. Rather, they had merely been given some additional copies of genes that they themselves employ in synthesizing L-tryptophan, which they need. It's just harmful to them if it isn't present in too high quantities, too high concentrations. So they carefully regulate the production so that they don't get too much. But the genetic engineering forced them to overproduce something that they ordinarily produce, okay? And that forced overproduction of one or another product is a feature of just about every genetically engineered food. Forced overproduction, often of a foreign product that has never been there. But as I said, in this case, it was of a gene, forced overproduction of a substance that those bacteria ordinarily manufacture anyway. It's additionally important to bear in mind that the lethal tryptophan supplements had passed through a very careful filtration process, and yet they were still toxic. Whereas fruits, grains, and vegetables reach the market in an unfiltered form. So any toxins that are generated there are not going to be filtered out to any extent. Well, what about the claim that no research has ever demonstrated harm caused by a GE food? In fact, the scientific literature provides clear indication that several well-conducted studies on bioengineered crops have in fact recorded harm. Among the many studies that have raised cautions, one not only demonstrated troubling effects, but strongly indicated that those effects were not caused by a specific feature of the inserted foreign gene, but instead were caused by some basic feature of the genetic engineering process itself, which has implications, as I said, for all genetic engineering. That study was published in the prestigious journal, The Lancet, and went through actually a doubly strict review process. Another well-conducted study that was published in a peer-reviewed journal demonstrated that a widely planted variety of Monsanto's Roundup-resistant GE corn, or to use the technical term, maize, that had been approved by regulators based on a medium-term 90-day toxicological feeding study, caused significant damage to the rat's livers and kidneys when tested over the long term, 2 years. Further, the research showed that the transgenic corn was toxic even when it was not sprayed with the Roundup. Moreover, they tested Roundup separately, administered at the same level that it would have been consumed in the standard feeding of genetically engineered corn, and they found the Roundup on its own was also toxic. So they found the corn was toxic when sprayed, when unsprayed, and that the Roundup, the most widely used herbicide in the world today, and one that's used in close to 80% of all genetically engineered foods on the market, was toxic on its own. So that study in itself really, if it were widely known, should pretty much stop the whole genetic engineering effort. But as we can discuss during discussion, it's been viciously and unjustly attacked, and most people, again, aren't aware of that study and aware of its solidity. Those results cast doubt on the entire GE food venture because no regulators require tests greater than 90 days, and several GE crops have entered the market without any toxicological testing at all. Now, the extent to which the GE food venture has failed to be evidence-based and instead has rested on the denial and disregard of the evidence has been vividly summarized by Michael Antonio, a molecular geneticist at King's College London School of Medicine. Here's his quote: "If the kind of detrimental effects seen in animals fed GE food were observed in a clinical setting, the product's use would be halted and further research instigated to determine the cause and to find solutions. However, what repeatedly happens in the case of GE food is that despite increasing evidence of serious adverse health test results, government and industry continue unabated with the development, endorsement, and marketing of these foods as if nothing has happened, to the point they even seem to ignore the results of their own research. And the extent to which the persistent misinformation has misled most scientists is attested by the molecular biologist David Schubert, a professor and laboratory director at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies, who has stated, I have spoken with many molecular and plant biologists who are not directly involved in producing GE foods, and it's clear that most have been misled about the basic facts. Schubert also pointed out that, quote, some plant biologists are making statements about GE foods that they almost certainly know are not true. So in light of the evidence, it's clear that genetic engineering has introduced a new dimension of unsustainability in agriculture, ethical unsustainability, because the massive venture to reconfigure the genetic core of the world's food supply has become crucially and chronically dependent on the distortion of truth, and it could not survive an honest airing of the facts. Thank you for your attention.